I'm Zach Goodrich. I'm the preserve steward at Tifft Nature Preserve, and along with other staff, I work for the Buffalo Museum of Science and am responsible for managing both the habitat and the trails here at Tifft. An invasive species is a plant or an animal or another organism that exists outside of its native range, where the ecosystem hasn't co-evolved with that species, and so oftentimes it can grow to populations that have negative impacts on other species in the environment. So common buckthorn is a plant that's from Europe, primarily from Eurasia, and it's a woody plant. Sometimes you'll see it as a tree, maybe the size of an apple tree or a little bit larger than that, and other times you'll see it as a shrub. It can form very dense thickets, so there's very little sunlight getting to the soil, and virtually no other plant species growing underneath that common buckthorn. So it's really a monotypic stand, meaning there's only one species growing in that area, and so it lacks that diversity that would support a variety of insects and other plants that would in turn create more of a diverse and functional ecosystem. So managing common buckthorn is very difficult. It's one of the most prolific invasive species in the region. We have a lot of things we want to protect: marshland, rare ecosystems, rare species that depend upon habitats where buckthorn's encroaching in it. And so it's those areas that we really want to protect and manage buckthorn so that native species and native plant communities can thrive and provide habitat for those species. So managing buckthorn, the approach generally it is combined between removing the plant itself, removing all the above ground mass, and then managing the root system in some way. There's a number of different ways to do that. The most effective way that I know of is a combination of removing that plant, so whether that's cutting it by hand with hand saws or chainsaws, or cutting it mechanically with something like a forestry mulcher that removes all the plant material above the ground, and then following up with herbicide. Tackling a small area of buckthorn, or if you have a relatively intact forest where you have a few buckthorn plants here and there, some of these tools can be helpful. So I'll start off with this. Mostly I've heard these have been referred to as a weed wrench. And essentially all they are is a clamp at the bottom and a long lever on the end, and the clamp attaches to the rootstock of the plant, and then you're able to clamp it and then use leverage to rip the plant out of the ground. This can be a good tool for if you've done an initial clearing project and you have a few plants remaining, you can come in and use this to rip those few scattered plants out. It's really handy for that. And especially handy if you don't have access to using herbicides, because you can remove the whole rootstock. The two most basic tools that you can use to manage buckthorn are just your standard pair of loppers here, and then in addition to that, basic pruning saw. So these types of pruning saws have teeth that are designed to cut both ways, but it's another good option, and especially for folks that don't have an access to a chainsaw or don't feel comfortable using a chainsaw, standard pruning saw is great. So this is a pruning chainsaw, and what's nice about it is that if you're in an area where you have a few stems of buckthorn here and there, scattered amongst maybe other desirable plants you want to keep, you can carry this with one hand and cut those stems pretty easily without starting and stopping a conventional chainsaw over and over again. So it's kind of light, it's easy just to pick up and cut with it. I'll say that herbicide combined with the other methods I mentioned, whether that's cutting individual stems with saws or loppers or whatever, or using a forestry mulcher to really clear and kind of mow the buckthorn down, some form of herbicide is going to be the most effective way to maintain that area after you've cleared it. The PP that you need for herbicide use is really dependent upon the product that you're using, but generally speaking, most products that you'll use for this type of work require safety glasses and then chemical resistant gloves here, in addition to long sleeves and long pants. So typically when I'm doing the cut stump, you want to cut the tree down, get it out of the way, or the shrub or whatever, and then treat the stump right away within the first couple minutes. If you wait, typically that cambium and that outer ring of tissue starts to heal over and it doesn't take the herbicide into the plant. And really the purpose of this is killing the root system. And so using this, it's a very effective method if you get the timing right, and you do it soon after cutting to kill that root system and prevent it from coming back next year. And the other positive of this is that it's very selective. So rather than using a sprayer where you're inevitably getting herbicide on other plants, maybe desirable plants, or just getting it on the ground, you can really focus on the stump and minimize sort of off-target application of the herbicide. The final method, this is kind of the broad method used for most things when they're growing, is a foliar spray. And this is a standard backpack sprayer, so it fits about 4 gallons. Usually I only fill it up to about 3 gallons to prevent it from splashing, but it's got this hand pump here to pressurize the tank, so you're usually constantly pumping that while you're working. And then a little wand with a trigger here. So just pushing this trigger will allow it to spray, and you can adjust the nozzle so you can change the pattern, whether you want the throw to be farther or whether you want like more of a fine mist. You can adjust that with this type of sprayer. And this is used for spraying leaves when the plant's actively growing. So typically in the middle of the summer, later in the summer, even early into the fall, this is a really effective application for buckthorn. Probably a little bit less effective than the cut stump because it's a little bit less direct. And depending on how much foliage the plant has, the amount of foliage that you're able to contact with the herbicide is related to how effective the treatment is, how much of that herbicide will get drawn down into the roots to then kill the plant. But usually when we do the forestry mulching, or if we've done another method for initially clearing the buckthorn, inevitably you're going to have stumps that are resprouting, or you're going to have seedlings that are germinating from the dense amount of seed that the buckthorn drops. So at Tifft Nature Preserve and other places, the foliar spray application for the amount of buckthorn we have is sort of inevitable. I'm not sure how we would manage the buckthorn without using this at least a little bit to push back on seedlings and resprouts and let the native plants reestablish. Buckthorn is one of the most impactful invasive species in Western New York. It is at the point where we aren't under the illusion that we're going to get rid of it from Western New York. It's sort of widespread across the landscape, but for protecting rare species or important natural areas like Tifft, we do want to manage it. This is common buckthorn right here. So this is buckthorn kind of in its shrubby thicket form. And if you look underneath here, you'll see every plant that I can see in this view here really is common buckthorn. I see no other plants growing, but where the buckthorn gets established to this level and creates this density of thicket, it typically impedes germination and growth of any other species. It gets so dark under this buckthorn in the growing season that very few other plants can actually get enough light to grow and make it up above the buckthorn. Buckthorn tends to modify the soil conditions so that it sort of favors itself and creates conditions where it can kind of dominate over other plants. So the carbon-nitrogen ratio particularly is impacted, where you have a higher ratio of nitrogen to carbon when buckthorn is present sort of at this level for an extended period of time. And it makes it that much harder for other native plants to compete with it. And particularly with buckthorn, and what you see in this area is nothing else growing in here. So this buckthorn has been here for decades at this point. So different from the thickets that you see, those thickets eventually turn into this situation where you have this really blank, empty ground, no other plants growing in this space. And really only these larger diameter buckthorns remaining here. So buckthorn, typically you see it in a dense setting like this with these sort of long, straight stems that can be 10 to 20 feet high. Oval-shaped leaves, but they have this sort of toothed margin here. So one dead giveaway for common buckthorn when it's of a sufficient size are these black berries, and they tend to form in clusters. And one of the only species you'll find growing at this density that will have a lot of large clusters of blackberries like this. So in addition to the physical methods of actually getting rid of the buckthorn or doing the initial removal of the buckthorn, for long-term success, really two key factors, and that's both consistency and replacing the buckthorn with something else. So over in this area here, this is the project we've worked on from 2019 until 2022, funded by the Niagara River Greenway Ecological Standing Committee. So the buckthorn was removed using manual means, so a lot of chainsaws, piling, chipping, and then a little bit of forestry mulching work in here as well. And we've reseeded this meadow here, and then we planted about 4,000 native trees and shrubs that you could find along the Niagara River, and you could find in some quality examples of natural areas in this area. So buckthorn is very prolific. Coming in and clearing it one time just doesn't work. Whether you're using a chemical means or a repeated clearing physically with saws or mechanical mowers or whatever you're using, you're going to have to follow up multiple times a year for several years in order to really see an impact on the landscape. In addition to that, replacing the buckthorn with something else is really important. So if you're trying to establish a native plant community, whether that's a pollinator meadow or reestablishing sort of a shrubby landscape or a forest or whatever it is, you want to make sure you're actively replanting that site or reseeding that site with something else. So bare root seedlings are a great thing to plant, but you can also plant potted trees or shrubs from the nursery as well. But it is important to plant something where you've removed the buckthorn in order to occupy that space and keep it from coming back.